One of my favorite parts about the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari is that it covers so many different subdisciplines, from music theory to anthropology to philosophy to botany to biology. And all of these fields come together in a massive concatenated theory in their seminal work, A Thousand Plateaus. It was published in 1980 and published into English in 1987. And one of the chapters or plateaus that gets a lot of attention in this work is 1837 of the Refrain. And each of their chapters or plateaus is dated, and they explain why they're dated. And they revolve around a sort of particular theme which helps to explicate their philosophy. And in On the Refrain, they're looking not only at music, and particularly at contemporary classical music, the likes of Pierre Boulez, for example, but they're also looking at the development of various territorial practices in animals and the way that they use elements of their environment to come up with these creative mating rituals or territorial rituals that signify the territory they're in, but is not as formulaic or repetitive as, for example, a dog or wolf peeing around the border of their territory to sort of box it in with pheromones and whatnot. But they point out a lot of these creative practices that non-human entities can engage with. And indeed, in the Geology of Morals, which is a famously difficult chapter in the book, they try to make the argument that basically geology is a creative process too of stratification. And I've done a lecture on the Refrain chapter before, but I wanted to use kind of an interesting example to illustrate how the refrain works, which is Qur'an recitation. Now, the refrain features very prominently, obviously, in this chapter, but it goes on to be used a lot in the work of Guattari, especially in like the Molecular Revolution of Brazil, is a work that he did that kind of uses the theme of refrains more, and I believe it was also used in Guattari's work before they wrote A Thousand Plateaus together. But the refrain is basically, it's kind of like the hook or the chorus in a piece of music. It's some sort of repetitive line which serves as a theme, but it always undergoes variation and allows for a sense of structure within a piece of music, but also deviation from that structure. And in order to make this example of Qur'an recitation make sense first, we just need to take a second to look at 3 different sections of the refrain to see exactly what they're trying to get at with the relationship between form and deviation from that form or variation upon that form. And really this is hearkening back to Deleuze's first work, Difference and Repetition, where we have sort of this dialectic, per se, of repetitive acts, which are allowing for example, cultural forms of expression to form over time as they get repeated, but also difference in variation, which makes the established formal territory also move alongside with that supposedly eternal cultural practice. So here on page 313 of the refrain, they say, every milieu is coded, a code being defined by periodic repetition. But each code is in a perpetual state of transcoding or transduction. Transcoding or transduction is the manner in which one milieu serves as the basis for another, or conversely is established atop another milieu, dissipates in it, or is constituted in it. The notion of the milieu is not unitary. Not only does the living thing continually pass from one milieu to another, but the milieus pass into one another. They are essentially communicating. The milieus are open to chaos, which threatens them with exhaustion or intrusion. Rhythm is the milieu's answer to chaos. What chaos and rhythm have in common is the in-between, between two milieus, rhythm-chaos, or the chaosmosis. So what they're trying to establish here is that within every system of established practice, whether this is politics or some sort of cultural expression or indeed Qur'an recitation, there is always a cycle or code which is repetition. But this repetition, which establishes a sort of territory for what this practice is itself constantly transcoding or transducing itself. It is constantly coming into new contacts with other milieus. Take, for example, a national identity. A national identity is established through the repetition of a national mythos. In the US, this is like Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, or kind of a praise for George Washington. And all of this comes together through repetition, which is primarily through education, to be formalized into a system that people can refer back to as a reference for their identity. But of course, as we know, those mythoses are always idealized to a certain extent, such that they tend to leave out some of the more nasty details like colonization, right? Or the repression of natives, or the infiltration of their economies and the acceleration of war within those economies and communities. So this milieu, which was established at some point, is constantly interacting with new milieus, that being new time frames, new cultural mindsets, which is causing this body of cultural knowledge that is the repetitious foundation for a society to be undergoing change, constantly dissipating into new things. And chaos is always threatening to infiltrate into those milieus. This would just be change. The milieu is always run up against the fact that knowledge dissipates with time, cultural dissipates with time. And especially in an interweaving modern world, there's a growing concern, especially of mixed communities of multiple different cultural heritages, of how to retain all these identities. And to a certain extent, for example, if you are Mexican and American, when these come together, a certain dilution of both of them is necessary. In a sense, you cannot be fully two things. There must be some sort of concession that has to be made, which is going to interfere with anyone ever completely assimilating to anything. And in response to this chaos, rhythm gets established. And this rhythm is basically that feeling of being at home, which is established through various traditions and various customs which reinforce that mythos, for example, with holidays, like national holidays, like the 4th of July. This could be like Bastille Day in France. And all of this serves to reinforce that mythos and fight against the chaos which is coming back. So really, the milieu, the sort of environment which constitutes all these behaviors and material matters into a coherent structure, is really a chaosmosis. It is a rhythm-chaos dichotomy that is constantly entertaining its own dissolution. Moving on, they state, a milieu does in fact exist by virtue of a periodic repetition, but one whose only effect is to produce a difference by which the milieu passes into another milieu. It is the difference that is rhythmic, not the repetition, which nevertheless produces it. Productive repetition has nothing to do with reproductive meter. This is the critical solution of the antinomy. And the point they're trying to make here is that, in fact, repetition in and of itself is productive. Insofar as, say we have the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Pledge of Allegiance gets repeated over and over. Each time it gets repeated, it is nevertheless a new addition to the utterance of that phrase. And thus, each time it comes back around, this periodic repetition is always entertaining a subtle change, a subtle vibratory motion of the milieu itself that is allowing for a sort of contestation of the rules of the game. So in the case of music, this comes together in the form of the milieu to make a melodic landscape. And they say the melodic landscape is no longer a melody associated with a landscape. The melody itself is a sonorous landscape in counterpoint to a virtual landscape. That is how we get beyond the placard stage. Although each expressive quality, each matter of expression considered in itself is a placard or poster, the analysis of them is nevertheless abstract. Expressive qualities entertain variable or constant relations with one another. That is what matters of expression do. They no longer constitute placards that mark a territory, but motifs and counterpoints that express the relation of the territory to interior impulses or exterior circumstances, whether or not they are given. No longer signatures, but a style. And the refrain is this element of style. It is a motif. And in the case of music, a motif is a very small group of notes with a certain rhythmic relation to one another that's repeated over and over in a certain way. And this establishes, of course, some repetitive quality to a piece that is self constantly developing. So a style underpins a piece of music, and indeed any matter of expression, by giving it some unity in which to ground itself, but a unity that even when it is repeated, is itself changing the very milieu, the melodic landscape, the sonorous landscape, which it is. The matters of expression themselves, which is to say things that mean things, that have a sense about them, as Deleuze puts it in The Logic of Sense, itself is a mobile territory, as Virilio puts it, habitable circulation. So what does all this have to do with the Qur'an? Now, I myself am not a Muslim, but I have an undying interest in Islam and the various liturgical practices that they undertake. And one of the important elements of Islam is, of course, the Qur'an. It is their holy text, and for them it is the Word of God. Now, the Qur'an is not just a dead text, which is constituted simply by writing it down and leaving it there. A key aspect of the Qur'an is that it is to be recited. Every time Muslims go to pray, they recite parts of the Qur'an led by the imam at the front, which is like the pastor. And in doing so, this establishes some repetitive foundation, which can definitely be seen through the lens of the refrain. It is a certain repetitive underpinning that constitutes their liturgical practices, but there is always an inescapable amount of change, or chaos, so to speak, which is infiltrating this practice. And within Islam, there's a strange dichotomy between trying to keep a certain core of Islam to stay the same, namely following the practices of the Prophet Muhammad, but in so doing, they are always trying to adjust the various rulings, for example, in terms of jurisprudence that Muhammad gave, of course, through divine inspiration and through divine dictation from the angel Gabriel. how to adapt those practices to different changing cultural situations in which maybe certain rulings are more obsolete in their context in the Quran and need to be reinterpreted. And this brings into a whole question, of course, the relationship of scholarship to Islam. But one of the ways in which chaos, quote unquote, infects Islam, but is treated with a dramatically more open attitude, is in the process of Qur'an recitation. Now, Qur'an recitation is ruled by Tajwid, which is basically rules of pronunciation and length of syllables, which grounds the official practice of reciting the Qur'an. So merely speaking the words is not enough. You have to pronounce the words a certain way such that you maintain the pronunciation that is as close to the Prophet Muhammad as possible. And also, you have to hold on to the emphasis through the amount of time that you hold on any syllable to, of course, do the same thing. But the melodies that underpin Qur'an recitation are completely impromptu. They are improvised by the person doing the recitation, and in this way, Tajwid serves as the underpinning refrain of established doctrine, so to speak, which runs under and serves as the milieu for the creative practice of improvisation through melody, which goes atop the rules of Tajwid. And what happens is we turn the bare text from something musically creative, which has a foundation upon which it is going. And there's always a dichotomy here, of course. You want to have some rules which are governing your creative practice, whether this is Qur'an recitation or whether this is art or music or politics, whatever you want to call a sort of artistic expressive matter. Yet, you don't want to be too rule-bound that you're not allowed to change enough. And the word enough there, of course, is very much a weasel word. How much is too much or not enough? It's very difficult to say. And one of the things that Deleuze and Guattari want to point out is that it's often, and indeed is always, circumstantial. How much you need to hold on to the rules or organs, as they put them, when talking about organs which have been imposed on the body, and the relationship between these organs, which are like established practices, and the body without organs, which resists organization, which tries to throw them off. There's the same sort of dichotomy. So when Muslims are reciting the Qur'an, an important surah or chapter that features in every single salah, which is to say their prayer, is surah al-Fatijah, which is the first chapter or surah of the Qur'an. And on its own, and I don't speak Arabic, I'm not Muslim, I just try to keep up, so forgive me for my less than Tajweed pronunciation. But on its own, the text is just 7 verses, and it goes like this. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata allazina an'amta alayhim khayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. So that's it on its own. Now I want to look here at 3 different recitations of al-Fatihah, which I've just found here on YouTube Shorts, and I want us to notice the variations in which they take that, no doubt, very boring recitation that I've done and flesh it out into something intensely creative, which I hope I'm not the only one who finds this very captivating.
الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين.
الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
Now, when we hear all that, we see a lot of variation. And some may oppose this and say that, in fact, this is too formalistic of a creative practice, that it doesn't allow for enough variation. And when I was researching for this and looking at different reciters, I stumbled upon, and I think this is a proper pronunciation of his name, Ustad Wissam Sharif. And he runs this channel, Qur'an Revolution, and he's a super wonderful reciter. And when talking about his journey, he elaborates a little bit on this dichotomy we mentioned between being extremely formalistic and being completely limp and without rules. And obviously the refrain allows us to straddle that horse in the middle. And when we do this, we allow ourselves to have some sort of grounding in a rule while also allowing for deviation. And in an ideal situation, we want the ratio between those two to be roughly identical. So here's Sharif to elaborate.
Years where I got comfortable, had a very Imam Sudais to it, until I could say, well, Wissam, what would you sound like if you said, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen? And that wasn't struggling, concrete, nor was it singy-songy, but it definitely sounded like me. So my own evolution, I was trying to squeeze, get all the tajweed out of it and make sure I get every drop of pomegranate juice. When I realized I was showing that I know the rules, as opposed to the rules being the string that held together this beautiful rack of lamb, this beautiful mattress of Qur'an. The delicate rules of the recitation are what brings the Qur'an to life.
So right, he is trying to fit in between these two, I can show my knowledge of Tajwid really well, versus, I can just be completely melodic. And if you listen to some recitations, they'll really go over the top with all the flair and the ornamentation on each syllable, hold it out for ridiculous amounts of times. And some people would say that this is violating Tajwid or going beyond it too much. And as a result, he himself is trying to bridge this divide, in which he actually uses quite Deleuzean language if we think about it. of the rules holding all this together, but actually also being the source by which to bring out the life of something that would otherwise be dead. So I hope this is interesting in terms of getting a look at how do we take practices which are repetitive and bring them to life in a way that allows for change, but also allows for it to be recognizable as such and such thing. To not necessarily devolve into something completely new without precedent, but to have some established differential relation to where we came from, and in so doing, chart a sort of creative genealogy in which we can say this new practice is unique and different, but not unbounded, not unrule-governed, but rather having a relationship to that established mode of practice, but having something unique which sets it apart, which is, of course, style, sensibility, uniqueness, thought, sobriety. I hope this has been interesting. Check out some of my other lectures I've done on Deleuze and Guattari, postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.